started with an introduction, and then we'll start at 4 sharp, so to be precise and as much of a stickler on time as possible. So thank you guys for coming today. I know the weather is a little bit cooler than it was yesterday, so maybe that's keeping the numbers down. But the good thing about that is that we can keep it more collegial and focus on the discussion, as I know Mr. O'Connell was keen on doing. So my name is Kevin Dunn. I see a few familiar faces here. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Public Outreach and Events Coordinator here. I'll make sure you guys have a very pleasant experience. We have some coffee and tea outside, as well as cookies, and those will be there for the next 15 or so minutes. I just want to briefly introduce the school. We're the Institute of World Politics, for those of you who are new. Again, we are a graduate school, and we focus on the aspects of national power as described by statecraft. We have 5 master's degrees and several professional certificates of study. If any of you are interested in further discussing a little bit more about our program or want to meet some of our students, please come to me after the event. I'm more than happy to discuss that with you. A few logistical things about today's event. Today will feature a book signing at the end. Mr. O'Connell has very graciously just agreed to sign copies of his book. He has 2 of his books, is that correct, sir? The first 2 of his Yankee Doodle Spy series available for purchase at a reduced price of $15 each. Cash and check will be accepted. His 3rd novel will be out in months to come, 2017. I just want to briefly introduce the speaker and the subject, and then we can get the ball rolling. The title of today's event is The Revolutionary War and the First Modern Insurgency. That will be one facet of the discussion that is subsequently going to be related today. Mr. O'Connell has served in the Department of the Army Staff in the Office of the Chief of Staff of the Army. He ended his counterintelligence career as a deputy commander of one of the largest counterintelligence units in the Department of Defense. He also has a lifelong interest in history. That's the subject and purpose of today's event. And of course, he is an author as well. He has published those 2 books of which I mentioned, and he has a 3rd one on the way. If you wish to reach out to him, he has a Facebook, a combination of Twitter, Facebook page and Twitter. His Twitter handle is at SW O'Connell, and his posts are at #RedWar. Without further ado, sir, I want to thank you for coming to IWP today.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you.
Forward to you. Thank you again.
Thanks to all the Kevins that got me here. We'll leave it at that. SW, but actually I go by Scott, so yeah, that's just my nom de plume. And what I'm going to do today is, it's not about insurgency per se. I do have a slide on that. But what I want to do is introduce the Rev War as something people who are looking at national security issues, military strategy, tactics, intel, ought to go back and look at, because there are a lot of lessons, I think, that harken from that period. Recently, there's been a spate of TV shows and things that kind of take you into that area. I will tell you, I started writing my first book years before those came out. These things don't happen overnight. So I'm glad to see this stuff came out. The first thing folks started calling me, "Oh my God, they're stealing your ideas." I said, "No, they're not. These are old ideas, and you know, how many James Bond spin-offs have there been? So no big deal." I'm more interested in the subject matter, and I've studied history, the undergraduate degree, all my time in the military in Europe, going out to places, studying, reading, but never this. I was always into the tip of Civil War, World War II, and my own little deviant area of interest in Napoleonic Wars, which I could probably spend a week talking about without any slides. But I decided, like a lot of guys in our business, we're in the Army, we're all sitting around eating lunch, "Oh, I'm going to write a spy book someday." I decided, well, yeah, but I don't want to get cross with the government, so I'll set mine in the past, and it will be fiction, because I frankly don't have time to do the research for nonfiction, at least right now. And I wanted to make sure that no matter what I wrote, it predated Title 18 United States Code, so I wouldn't be able to be prosecuted for anything. So it got me into the Rev War. And I'll be honest, I didn't know much about the Rev War, so the first question I would ask a group like this is, has anybody taken a course on the Revolutionary War in college, grad school? One, okay. Well, I got... Oh, okay. Well, but even in those places, well, West Point was at the heart of our first espionage challenge in the United States. And we had a CI conference there many years ago, and The general that opened it up for us was Abizaid. Happened to be Abizaid was a 1-star, and that was how he opened it up. So, and that's the one thing I'm not going to talk about, and I don't cover in any of my books, is Benedict Arnold for that reason. Kind of a known commodity. And so we're going to go into some other areas. But I just threw this up here because these are the reasons why I think we ought to be thinking about the Rev War. It was a lot of things. It was very unique in its time. It captured the world, frankly. I mean, when you study it, you realize how much this did really impact Europe, because it impacted the greatest power in Europe at the time, which was Britain. So it has elements of all these things. It's a little bit of all, and that's what kind of makes it interesting. It started out as a political struggle, internal, and exploded into eventually a world war. And there's all kinds of issues that somebody who studies this will really learn. And I'm not an expert. I'm not a scholar on it. I've probably read 50 books since I started doing this thing, plus lots of other stuff I've tapped as well for background. And it also started way before 1776 and 75. So just to show that it was part of a continuum of activity, some of the roots of the revolution took place even prior. The French and Indian War, friction began between the colonies, and even among the colonies. We had issues on the frontier, and there's a big component to the frontier with this war that I really never even thought about. Being a New York East Coast guy, you don't really think about the American Revolution being at the frontier being the Appalachian Mountain Range, and a little bit beyond that. Actually, further beyond that than I thought by the end of the war. But lots of things that were going to lead up to the friction and some of the political ideas that were developing in the colonies that led to the political movement that led to the turmoil that led to the war. So it started much, much earlier than even 1775. And the causes are, you probably studied some of these in high school, but they were all there. There was certainly financial issues with the British and the need for raising more money, trying to recoup the losses that started to create some angst that we, I guess, based on the last election, still feel today. Trade was an issue. We were definitely in a colonial situation. There were restrictions on who the colonies could trade with directly, imposed by Britain. So it's still a mercantile system in that sense. Again, the taxation, we all know about that. But the Western policy was there too, because even around the time of the French and Indian War, the British settlers on the East Coast started looking for new land across the mountains, came into conflict with the Indians. And when the British won the French and Indian War and the Treaty of Paris of, I think, 1764, gave them what was French North America, their whole approach changed because they wanted to keep the Indians pacified. They wanted to keep the French Canadians pacified, and they really didn't want the Americans moving across the mountains to stir up much with the Spanish, who were the further to the west. So there were some deliberate moves to try to restrict westward expansion. So besides the taxation, besides the trade differences, and the Americans, and we still do, have an insatiable need for land, but back then we certainly did. People came to the colonies for land primarily, even if you started out with nothing. The chance that you were going to get something, and land was cheap and labor wasn't. So there were opportunities there, and certainly the West offered more. British wanted to maintain equilibrium, so there was certainly some pressure there to not move further west. That's just a quick snapshot of the area of operations. I'm not going to have any other maps. I won't have too many dates in this discussion. We just want to talk about some of the concepts. But you can see the area of operations, and that's really not the entire area of operations if you include later on when the French and the Spanish come in. It becomes a global war. And even within the even within the confines of this, there was activity along the Mississippi River later on as well, not with so much with the Americans, but with the Spanish and some Americans who happened to live out in that area. So it was pretty expansive, ranging from Quebec and Montreal down to Florida and as far west as the Mississippi, in an era when most people traveled at the speed of a man on foot or a woman on foot. Those were long distances to go. So geography played a big role. Waterways were critical, and there wasn't much in between. So some things to think about in America at the beginning, at the period that the war shaped up. Britain had 12 million people. We had 2.5. I never knew that. I always thought we were much small, even a lighter population than that. And we had the highest standard of living in the world at that time, based on not riches, but on the average person's life expectancy, access to food, good food, living space, those types of things. If you were a middle class or even a lower middle class, if I can use those terms back then, you had a much higher standard of living than somebody living in a city in Britain or a city in France or a city in Spain. So it wasn't an issue of, poor settlers hanging on by the skin of their teeth, facing the major power. We were small, but we were actually pretty prosperous. So it wasn't purely about prosperity, but about the idea of growth and the ability and independence. Our infrastructure, though, was next to nothing. There weren't that many roads, but there were enough roads to move things around between the big cities, primarily post roads, and then a lot by waterway. So the waterways throughout the course of this war became critical. Expansion was growing, and the merchant marine, which was growing. We were building ships finally in America, not warships, but merchant ships. But we had restrictions on that, adding to some of the friction between us. And then the political parties over on the colonies roughly mirrored what was going on in Britain. You had Whigs and Tories, and the Whigs were, more power to Parliament, and the Tories were more power to the Crown. That's roughly it. And it was a very gray area because they were all, the Whigs were also noblemen or men of property. They weren't. We're not talking about the proletariat now. We're talking about all propertied and money people, but they still had basic ideas on governance and the rule, and they were essentially the same here as they were in Britain, which did a couple of things. It gave the Whigs, the Patriots, natural allies in Britain, and at the end, just as many other wars of this type, it was the politics over there that helped drive the British to the peace table. So it also helped if you talk about the Intel War, as the sides, depending on what side you were on, those are the people that you're probably going to go to for information, for intelligence, for cooperation. And they broke down roughly along those lines. And of course, the French are chafing. They lost that war pretty bad. They lost much more than Canada to the British. In fact, they were more upset about many of the losses of the islands they had to give up in the Caribbean, in the Indies, to the British, and which were of more value, and areas in other parts of the world. But they are sitting there on the sideline as well, so they were a player. I'm not going to go into the weapons, other than everything was pretty up close. We didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. The closest thing to that would be a something larger than a 12-pound cannon, maybe a 24 or 32-pound gun, and those are usually on fortresses. Most of the combat was musket, some rifles. Pistols were really probably going to hurt the carry of the pistol as much as the guy firing it. They weren't very accurate, but cannons were, if properly used, but the terrain influenced that. You could only get them to certain types of terrain. They tended to be very light caliber cannons, sabers and swords, bayonets, tomahawks, and hunting knives. And I'll just say real quickly, the bayonet was important. One edge the British had on us in the beginning was bayonets on their muskets, And in the very beginning of the war, most, not all, some did, but most American troops did not have bayonets. And they could not stand very well against a firm bayonet charge. It was a very big morale factor with those bayonets coming at you once you fired your one round. You know, single shot, muzzle loading rifles. A trained expert could get off 3 rounds a minute, but in the heat of battle, your average guy maybe 1 minute, 1.5 a minute. So everything was up close and dirty. A lot of Americans troops carried the tomahawk, a very simple, basic axe, copied from what the Indians used, and a hunting knife. Later on, when the French come in, we'll talk about that. They started being armed more typically like the British, because despite the Americans sniping from behind trees and all that, which did happen, most of the American generals, especially Washington, favored meeting the British on even terms in an open battle whenever they could. And it was about a 50-50 mix of success. Here's just another map of the AOR. I'm just gonna work through this. We're gonna start sort of the way the war did. Starts up north and kind of works its way to the south. That's kind of a generalization, but the geography and just I just think the strategy that the British used kind of they still in the beginning had the freedom of action over us to move, primarily because of their naval forces and their transport. They could dictate the terms at the beginning of where they went, pretty much throughout the war, and it was the colonists meeting them. And of course, the first place they did that was in Boston. So it all started in Boston politically. You go there, you learn all about that, and go on their Patriot March that they have. But it happened to be a center of Whig sentiment and certainly anti-taxation. A lot of this problem with taxation is connected to smuggling. I'm not going to talk too much about smuggling, but there was a big smuggling industry there up in the north, in the Northeast, and so you have for example, John Hancock was a wealthy man, and most of his money came from smuggling. Because I talked earlier about the trade restrictions on the Americans, these were to circumvent that. It's like anything else you do. If you regulate something, pardon? Goods that they could not trade directly. Also, just molasses to make rum from the Indies. So there was, Hancock was a smuggler. And that's how his family made their money. So you're avoiding the taxes. Taxes weren't even that high, but there was great profits in the smuggling. That happened through the war. I mean, that was one of the reasons why we survived that long, because the smugglers, some became privateers, which interdicted British merchant traffic, and that later on has a big, as the war grows on, it got worse and worse for the British, and we had to get all our goods through the British Navy during the war. So it played a role that isn't written much about, but it's certainly there. But we wound up getting an army, colonial army, fought the British outside of Boston, up on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. We lost the battle because we were short on powder and shot. Had we been able to, we probably would have done more damage to the British than we did, but it was a big loss for them. They lost hundreds and hundreds of men killed, and in that period, even in the 18th century, unless it was a pitched battle, the casualties usually weren't that high. One side would break pretty quickly. So they lost a lot of men. So it was a Pyrrhic victory for them, and they weren't able to push out of the area. They were still contained within Boston. So some things that happened there is we did drag guns. I believe, as an old Army guy, if you don't have cannons, you really don't have an army. So secret operation, Benedict Arnold and a guy named Ethan Allen led some troops, Green Mountain Boys and others, to the west and captured Fort Ticonderoga. They stormed it in the morning or late night, captured the fort, captured the ordnance. So he was able, Nathaniel Greene then dragged these guns from there across the mountains in New England to the area around Boston. We were able to then besiege the British in Boston. And the British were very indecisive. They didn't push out after Breed's Hill. A lot of this was due to good intelligence on our part. We had good reports coming from Boston on what the British were about. And when Washington shows up to take command, he started using some deception operations against the British, primarily to convince them he had more ammunition than he had. He was down to a couple of rounds per man, and so he started leaking. Usually it was couriers would drop pouches in areas that they know the British were patrolling. These were types of techniques they used. But the British finally were forced out. Fortunately they had the ships they could pull out, and they gave the city up in early '76, and prepared for the next move. And they went to Halifax with their fleet, but their ultimate objective was to go to New York and Washington. He didn't know that through intelligence. He just from a good assessment of the geography and where the British would be best served with their navy was New York. It had the harbor, had the Hudson River, which is tidal quite a bit up the river, so tall ships can sail up there. You've got Long Island Sound. So if you got a navy, that's a really good place to go. So he marched the army south to set up defenses in New York, which I put too big to fail and too big to defend, and it was. He had a pretty large army, over 20,000 men, but it's a large area to defend when the other side's got the ships and most of the guns. And so Battle for Long Island, my first book, I'll just say, covers that in detail. So the history part of that is about as accurate as I could make it. I just tell the story through the eyes of some fictitious characters who intertwine with the actual historic people like Washington, Benjamin Talmadge, Nathaniel Greene, and others who were players in that particular campaign. The British moved slowly but very professionally against us in New York. They used their really good air or sea-land operations, landing troops, moving inland, extracting troops. They did it very well. They did well with their artillery. And Washington threw about a third of his army into Long Island, and he almost got that annihilated. There were 3 passes that his men were guarding, but they only actually guarded 2. One, he put a couple of scouts out there. A Tory, a British sympathizer, reported to the British, a spy, that last pass was undefended. And that was out of the place called Howard Tavern. I happen to live near there. If you saw Goodfellas, it's right near where the scene of that movie is with the Gaudis. It's over near Kennedy, getting out towards Kennedy Airport. So the British did a night march with 24,000 men out that way, and then cut back into what is today downtown Brooklyn, and cut off the Americans guarding the passes, which is the passes are the last ice age in North America stopped along the line of Long Island, and when the ice receded, it left about 130 foot in elevation ridge across Long Island. And it's hardly noticeable today with everything built up, but back then it went from, the area looked a little bit like the eastern shore of Maryland, if you can picture that. It was pretty flat and plenty of farmland and woods, but they called it the Great Moraine. It rose up like a series of hills right across, stretching out across the island. So those were the passes that Washington was trying to defend, and but it was one pass not covered. So they were cut off. He wound up pulling his men back into the defenses, and then after a very heated council of war, he was able to get his army out before the British launched the final attack. And the British were indecisive. British Commander General Howe was very plodding, very slow. He was also kind of a Whig. He was politically a Whig, and there's some thinking, a lot of the senior British officers were Whigs. So the theme throughout the war, especially in the beginning, the end things got kind of bitter, was that we didn't want to get too brutal with these Americans because they're really Britons. They're really, we want to come together. They really wanted to come together and bring them back under the crown. Many of the senior British officers actually favored many of the political tenets of the American Revolution and some of the things the Americans were politically striving for. So Washington does finally decide to retreat, gets his army back in the face of the British. He was pretty lucky. He had fog all night. And when the British finally showed up on what is today the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge, the Americans were on the other side. But they were able to launch several weeks later across right where the UN building is today. They landed at Kips Bay. Washington again almost got cut off. He had to pull his army back. You remember Nathan Hale? I'm not going to go too much into that, but that was a period of time he sent Nathan Hale back behind British lines. But it was OBE again, traveling at the speed of a man on foot. Hale got caught, but by the time he got caught, the British were already in Manhattan and getting ready to move on further up. So that was a case of a failed intelligence operation. He was just an officer who volunteered. There was no training, very little tradecraft used. He went in undercover, but he had notes and things, and when he got captured, he didn't have much of a chance. But the British did lose a few casualties in this campaign, and one of the themes is every time they lost a trained British soldier or a Hessian, really Germans, they weren't all from Hesse, it cost the king. And this was, it cost them to train, equip, and send a soldier over, and the resources were only went so far. That becomes an issue as the war drags on. So even as we're losing battles, every time we inflict a casualty, it's a chip against the Crown's objectives. And that becomes part of Washington's strategy. He realizes he's not going to be able to stand up too well. His army broke and ran in Manhattan. It tried to fight on Long Island and got destroyed. In Manhattan, it just broke and ran when the British landed there on the East River. He was able to slow the British up in the White Plains. But even there, he got, again, this guy Howe was slow, but he was effective, and Washington almost lost his army again. So over this period of time, he starts thinking about Fabian warfare, which is sort of a resistance movement kind of warfare, instead of a war of posts. And that was a big discussion they would have. Do we defend cities? Do we defend specific points on the ground or not? And over time, it became or not. Now, it wasn't something Washington wanted to do. He would rather have faced the British like happened on Breed's Hill. He happened not to be there for that battle. But every time he did that, things didn't always work out. And partly it was the bayonet, quality of the troops, lots of things that added up. But he started to develop this idea of a Fabian type of warfare. Fabian coming from a Roman general named Fabius, who against the Carthaginians when Hannibal invaded Rome, he had the greatest army and he was the best general of his age, and they stumbled upon the idea of let's just pull back and wear them down over time. That's what they wind up doing. Interestingly enough, in the 18th century, most educated Britons studied the classics, so all these guys were very familiar with famous Romans in antiquity, and they studied Latin literature, Roman history. Whether that idea came specifically from him or not, I don't know. I haven't found that. But it did develop over time. So he pulls into New Jersey, and when the British finally cross over in November of '76, it's essentially a blitzkrieg. He barely escapes from Fort Lee, New Jersey. Lucky guy. I guess Bridgegate almost got the British, but not quite. And the army essentially retreats across New Jersey. They go to Hackensack, down in Newark, Brunswick, and then straight across to where Trenton is today, and then over the river into, they just barely get over the Chesapeake River with General Cornwallis. Delaware. Did I say Chesapeake? Delaware River. Cornwallis on his heels. But the one thing Washington did, unconventional warfare, thinking out of the box, he had them police up all the boats along the Delaware, thank you, for about 18 miles in either direction. So there were no boats when the British got there. They had no amphibious craft. They didn't bring anything with them. This was kind of a flying column of 5,000 men moving lightly. So Washington was able to stop them, slow them down. And then this General Howe, again, was very cautious. He goes into winter quarters, and they all go to garrisons. And of course, you know that Washington, in the dark of the winter, on the 26th of December, he decides to strike back. Now, and he made the comment, are we really this good at retreating? Because he didn't want to do it, but they got away every time. That it looked like the game was over. And at this period of the war in '76, George Washington was already known as the essential guy. He was the man kind of holding the country together. He was the closest thing we had to a president, even though he wasn't president. Congress was not organized. You know, there was a president of the Continental Congress, but he was not an executive. So the nation looked at Washington as the kind of the inspiration for the country. Charles Lee, he was Washington's second in command. Now there's an interesting tale behind General Lee. He was a British general, fought in the French and Indian War, stayed in America, became an American, had a little stint over in Europe as a mercenary for a couple of different countries, but finally wound up settling in Virginia. And when the war broke out, he became second in command to Washington. Very quirky guy, did not like Washington, thought he should have been the commander-in-chief. And there's lots of writing on this, whether he was a British agent or not. He certainly wanted to be in charge. Anything that hurt Washington was okay with him. So after Washington went over to New Jersey, he left Lee with part of the army. But he started writing immediately for Lee to come over with his 5,000 men. And Lee took his time slowly. Meanwhile, the British are already halfway to the Delaware River. He finally has to move, but when he's about halfway from the Hudson River to the Delaware in the mountains, the Watchung Mountains of New Jersey, right off of I-78 in central Jersey, he left his division one night and went a couple of towns over to a tavern to spend the night at the tavern. Why he was there, nobody knows, but he went to the tavern, he had a good time, and in the morning he was captured by a guy named Bannister Tarleton and a detachment of British Dragoons. How they knew he was there, why he was there, that's very much subject to speculation. But that did two things. That gave the British a hostage that was very important to them, but it also freed Washington of having to deal with this guy. And he got his men back, and that's what reinforced him so that he could then strike the British at Trenton. That was only a minor, I mean, they captured about 1,100 Hessians, killed about 80 of them, wounded a few more. But the big thing was we struck back. He kind of saved the revolution, that one act, because things looked pretty bad for the country. So the end of '76, early '77, he turns it around. Literally days after, he decides to try it again. He crossed the Delaware, but two of his units that he had ordered over to help him at Trenton got there late, and once they were, because of the ice. Remember, Washington's crossing through the ice. So he had two units stuck on the other side. He decided to risk another attack, and he went back over and attacked the British. The British attacked him at Trenton. There was a second battle. He was almost pinned and pushed into the Delaware for good, but again, at night he escaped. He had an agent that knew a way out of there that the British didn't know about, and he was able to flank the British and strike up, attack Princeton. So he got into the British supply lines. And this was a year of maneuver and movement. Went into winter quarters, but during the winter, Washington allowed the militia of New Jersey to attack the British. Every time they came out of their cantonments for food, they were foraging. This is called the Forage War by some. The Winter War, and there were a couple of winter wars here. But the militia, as the British would send out 50 men, they'd attack with 100. And as the British sent more out, we'd attack with more. And it got pretty vicious to the point where the British lost more men during that winter fighting than they did in the other campaigns leading up to it. So again, when you're getting into this kind of small tactical combat, things can get especially in a period when men didn't fight that way. During this period, warfare was very organized, very structured. This was certainly turning into a different kind of war for the British. But by the spring, the British were back in action, and Howe, although he was back in New York for the winter, once he came out, the British had a grand plan, and one general named Burgoyne developed the idea to come down from the north in Canada. Howe would send troops up from New York. They'd meet in the middle, cut the colonies in half. You've all probably heard about that in school. Didn't happen. Howe had a different opinion. He didn't want to be a sideshow to the main attack from Canada. He wanted to capture the American capital once and for all, something he failed to do the following year. So he paid lip service to his orders, and the orders were not explicitly written. It gave him a lot of latitude. So he used that latitude to take his army and go south. And they actually sailed down into the Chesapeake, back up, landed at Head of Elk in Delaware, and then marched up towards Philadelphia. Washington tried to stop him at Brandywine, got beaten, tried to stop him again at Germantown, just outside of Philadelphia, got beaten again, and then he had to head to a place called Valley Forge, and we lost our capital. But Valley Forge turned out to be, wasn't the worst winter, by the way. You read about Valley Forge. The following winter and the winter after that were actually worse, weather-wise. And Valley Forge did some good things for the Army. He was able to train the Army, brought in, you've heard of Baron von Steuben. He was not really a baron, but he was actually an officer in the Prussian Army. And not a nobleman, he took the title. But he did know how to drill troops. He wrote what they call the Blue Book, which was the first training manual for American troops. And throughout the winter, he trained the Army. So by the time the spring came, things were looking better as far as the Americans as a fighting force. So I will say about 77, the Battle of Saratoga was fought up north. You know, that was the turning point. The invasion from the north was not well executed. It moved too slowly. The commander in charge, again, he started trying to take posts up along the waterway from Canada, which is Lake Champlain and Lake George. He deviated. He followed some bunny trails. He had a huge Indian force that did not treat the locals well. That gave the Americans a lot of propaganda use, which enabled them to stir up more militia and have more men join the regiments. So by time he worked his way down from the Canadian border to just north of Albany, the American Army outnumbered his. He was down to about 8,000 men. The Americans had about 25,000 men. We had fixed positions. He tried to attack once. He was beaten back. It kind of was a stalemate. But he came out for a second attack, and that was a pretty controversial battle. That involved Benedict Arnold, a famous traitor, but he was actually a hero of those two battles. And he actually led the Americans out of their positions, counterattacked the British, and their whole attack collapsed, and they retreated. And a few weeks later, they surrendered because their supplies had run out and winter was coming. So Field Army surrendered to an American army, unheard of. It was huge news in Europe, in all the capitals. This was huge news in Britain too, and not in a good way. So this becomes the turning of the tide. I'm not a big believer in the decisive battle, but certainly when the French learned of this, they had already, and we're going to talk about it, they had already been covertly supporting the American cause for quite a while. This convinced the king to move towards a formal treaty of cooperation with the Americans, and believe that was decisive in us getting through this. So, global war in 79. Things kind of quieted down. 78 was, I kind of brushed through 78. Let me back, let's see if I can. 78 was a year that turned the British in different directions, but there were no big battles, no major engagements, but there was a lot of up and down the Hudson. I have a theory that the British kind of turned New York into the green zone, if you know what that was in Baghdad. You get a safe area, people are real comfortable operating out of there, the generals get comfortable operating out of there, and in the war, we can say whether this was an insurgency or not, but it was certainly a lot about convincing the Americans that they were British, not Americans, convincing them that they should be loyal to their king and not something else. And this was a struggle they had. They had a pretty good army, and wherever the British army went, they typically were able to win the hearts and minds. The minute they moved somewhere else, the Americans would come in pretty brutally and aggressively, and it was a tough war. At the tactical level, there was fighting up and down that seacoast all the time. There was literally hundreds and hundreds of engagements during the American Revolution. It was an 8-year war. It was not a short war. And at the local level, there was fighting almost constantly in areas from New York to the Carolinas. New England kind of pacified pretty quickly. Once the British left Boston, maybe Belichick was training his football team, I don't know. But they were quiet. But everywhere else, at the local level, the Whigs and the Tories, the Patriots and the Loyalists were in constant struggle. And the British could not seem to get a good handle on how to take the Loyalists who supported them and use them most effectively against the Americans. They typically viewed them as an adjunct to the British forces. They didn't try, and I really think if they had went the other way and built their forces around the Loyalists, they would have, in the long run, been much more effective in the battle. Hudson was a stalemate. The British would try to move up and down the Hudson. In 78, there was an attack on several of the forts along the Hudson. West Point was a key place in stopping the British from getting up there. We chained the Hudson. The West opened up. There had been attacks from western New York and Canada against us, so that whole area about 50 miles west of Albany was a frontier, and there was constant combat between the Loyalist settlers there and the Patriot settlers, or the Whigs, the Americans, and the Indians. The Indians were kind of caught in the middle, and that was the sad part. Most of the Iroquois stayed loyal to the British, who treated them very well. Local Americans did not treat them very well, so they went with the side they thought would best heed their interests, and that caught them in the middle. So in 79, they had actually attacked a couple of American settlements and burnt them down, pillaged and all that stuff. They were led by Loyalists, British Loyalists. It wasn't just the Iroquois. But Washington decided he was going to get rid of that sideshow, and he sent the General John Sullivan out with a division, about 5,000 men, mostly locals. And they swept through all the Iroquois villages along what's now the Mohawk Valley and just wiped them out, and drove the Iroquois. Most of them had finally wound up along the Canadian border and in what is today Canada, and kind of a sad sideshow, if you will. The British the British had taken in 78, I should have said they took Savannah, so they did shift south. They started grabbing parts of what is today northern Florida. The French come into the war in 79, and they tried to go after Savannah. They had interests in that part of the world, and they got Spain there too, and that failed. That was the first combined Allied operation, and it did not go well. British had good intel. Their spies were out there. They knew exactly when the French and Americans were coming by land and where they were going to attack. So their offenses around Savannah were well thought out, and they beat back the French and the Americans. Spain enters the war in that summer, and that gets interesting. I'm not sure if I have a slide on it, but Spain dragged its feet, and it was not very pro-American in the sense of the cause of independence, but it wanted some of its land back from the British. They had their Governor General of Louisiana at the time was a guy named Antonio de Galvez. He was a nobleman and a career military officer. By their fortune, he was governor in Louisiana, but he knew this was coming already, so he had prepared what Spanish forces he had, local Spanish settlers, Indians, and Anglo-Americans who had settled along the Mississippi River. And as soon as he got word that Spain was in the war, he attacked the British in Baton Rouge, and he took Baton Rouge, he took Pensacola, and Mobile. So he knocked out those 3 British outposts within about an 8-month period. His nickname was Yo Solo, I alone, because his attack against Pensacola, he anticipated, was expecting a big force from Spain to come with ships and soldiers, and they never arrived. And the campaign season was ending, and by this time he was in Cuba, waiting for all these troops. They never came, so he said, "I'll go alone." He took what he had, and he was able to storm the city, and the British surrendered. So the city of Galveston, Texas, is named after him, although he never was in Texas. But he became kind of a folk hero in that part of the world and got the name. Meanwhile, John Paul Jones, heard of him? He goes over to Europe. Now, our U.S. Navy was not a big deal in this war. We were kind of a show Navy to show we could take the British on one-on-one in a naval war, ship to ship, and defeat them. John Paul Jones certainly did his share of that. So he made a very famous naval raid around England, which again sent the message to the British people. The war was coming to them. It wasn't very successful. He raided a town called Whitehaven. That didn't go well. But the fact that he was off there and they were actually able to watch him fighting British ships off their coast had a chilling effect on the local populace. And let's see, the Indies, the French, when they came in, the first thing they did was go after some of the islands in the Indies. The British had to counter that. So now they have to start taking forces away from the main part of America to start defending things in the Caribbean and other parts of the world, both naval and ground forces. That helped the cause. So these countries coming in were a big deal. So the British, what do? Let's say, let's go south. We tried the middle Atlantic, we tried the north. Let's try again in the south. They did try to take Charleston in early '76, but it failed. Famous battle there, and the palmetto logs stopped the British rounds coming off their ships. But actually, and I'm going to talk a little bit about hydrography, but it was the shoals and everything. The British had a couple of ships run aground in Savannah in that particular campaign, and they pulled out. And they didn't go back until '80. They finally decided to try it again. This time they were successful and they took Charleston. But again, they turned Charleston kind of into their green zone in the beginning until Cornwallis showed up. He was made commander-in-chief in the south. And he decided to do what they probably should have done up north all along, which was occupy the land, as much land as possible, be out there where the people were. And so they attacked a string of American posts from Charleston out to the mountains in the west. One of the famous one was a place called the 96. It was a fort. I think it changed hands about 4 times during the war, and a couple of times during this particular year. The Carolinians were sort of ambivalent. You've heard, and if you studied in high school, they say 30-30-30 at the beginning of the war. And it might have been. I think it quickly went 20-40-40. It kind of shifted. It depended on where you were and what was going on. Certainly up in New England, it was never 30-30. But New York, New Jersey, they were testy. And the Carolinas were kind of quiet until the British landed and started moving their forces inland. And atrocities started taking place. The loyalists that were with the British, there were a lot of vendettas, and this was on both sides. So both sides struck each other at the local level all the time. It was very personal. You knew those guys on the other side of the county were pro-British, and when you had a chance, you took them out, and vice versa. So this kind of backfired in the Carolinas to where, over time, the people really turned against the British. The loyalists were dwindling in numbers. And you couldn't admit to it even if you were one, and it was pretty bloody. They were hoping that this would at least settle the southern question and enable them to turn back north, but it wound up being their morass, their Vietnam, whatever you want to call it. But it was a year-long struggle. And again, think about Vietnam. It was very local, lots of thick woods. Along the coastal area is very swampy. You've heard of the swamp fox. The swamps were real, and they played a role. There were lots and lots of rivers in the Carolinas that impacted how the war was fought. And, if it was an insurgency, it went both ways, because both of these people were fighting each other in a very vicious way. I mentioned Bannister Tarleton capturing General Lee up in New Jersey. By this time, he is now commanding the Tarleton's Legion, which was a combination of infantry and cavalry. You had a couple of guns. They were Americans, and they were very brutal. Now, a lot of propaganda during the war on both sides, but the Americans got really good at it. So if the British did something minor, the Americans were very good at blowing that thing up into something much more than it was. And over time that took. So propaganda, either spreading the truth or even the untruth, over time it took. And Tarleton was hated. He had a price on his head, and he usually won. He didn't always win. He lost one big battle, but generally considered their best counter-guerrilla, if you will. And meanwhile, Moultrie and Francis Marion, the famous swamp fox, down along the coast, they kept the British pinned down. They threatened Charleston. They interdicted supplies. All this going on while the British are trying to subdue the western part of the state. And it didn't go well over time. We won a battle at Kings Mountain, which was the far end of the western end of the state. What happened here was British sent another really good guerrilla fighter, a guy named Ferguson, Scotsman and major, and kind of an inventor. He actually invented a repeating rifle that worked during that period. It just was very expensive, so the British Army did not adopt it. So, but he had done a lot of fighting against the Patriots in New Jersey. Now he's down south, so he grabs about 1,000 loyalists, 1,200 loyalists, and they're threatening the West. And then these over-the-mountain men. I talked earlier about the settlers who were crossing the Alleghenies, getting into it with the Spanish and with the Indians. These are tough guys. And they gathered a group, and they rallied for the cause, not the king. Once they did, they marched east. They were going to meet another column. They didn't have to. They wound up pinning the British at a place called Kings Mountain. And Ferguson and his boys, they retreated up onto the hill and just got shot to death. Most were killed. So that was a big blow to the British. That kind of ended their hopes of keeping the interior. And the West rallied, the South rallied, and then the Battle of Camden gets fought, which was it's one of the bigger battles in the South. But the real story of the South is the guerrilla war and that kind of local savage fighting, the most vicious fighting in the war. We lost the Battle of Camden, and by the way, the loser of that battle was General Gates, Horatio Gates, who was the victor of Saratoga, the big victory over the British. Had a first time ever a British army surrendered. They sent him south, and he failed very badly. So Nathaniel Greene, who was considered the best general in the American army, perhaps better than Washington, he gets sent south, and he decides to adopt the strategy: lose till we win. We'll just keep fighting these guys till we win. Again, the idea of Fabian warfare. So it really becomes a war, a civil war, a war of maneuver, and we actually start to win a couple of battles. That's the amazing thing. Dan Morgan, they sent him south as well with Nathaniel Greene. Morgan was born in Pennsylvania but settled in Winchester, Virginia, and he led the famed Rifle Regiment. They were very instrumental at Saratoga, best shots in the Army, and he actually got the militia to stand up to the British in a pitched battle. He came up with a very simple plan, an elegant plan to beat them, was able to articulate it to the men. He said, guys, they're coming at you. I want you to give me 2 shots, and then you can do what you want to do. And that's what they did. They took their shots, and then they retreated behind the main American force. And we beat the British in that battle, Battle of the Cowpens. These things started to add up over time. As we start winning battles we shouldn't win, it starts to send a message to both sides. So Greene finally has to face, as he's trying to maneuver, he's not trying to engage the British, but he gets forced into an engagement at Guilford Courthouse, and although he loses and has to withdraw, the British took a lot of losses, about as many as the Americans. And I talked earlier about the cost of a soldier in combat. It cost the king a lot of money, and these every time we had plenty of troops on the ground, locals. They'd have to train, equip, and send one over, and the pipeline, frankly, had stopped, economically unfeasible. So This is another one that kind of put them on the, had them rethinking their strategy. But we fought a few more battles, but finally the South Carolina part of the theater was lost, and Cornwallis decides he's got to get out of there. It was not tenable, so he left the garrison in Charleston, took what part of the army that was still healthy, and he decided to march north. He had pursued Greene up to the border, then he decided to go into North Carolina, and eventually his goal was to get into Virginia and get to a place called Yorktown, where he could be either reinforced by troops from New York. And that did not happen. So this is, I call this one deception because it's the Yorktown campaign. This is one where intelligence and deception operations really played a role. I knew nothing about this until I started delving into this stuff a little bit, and any of the classes I had never really went into the deception part of this. But it was sort of a campaign that wasn't supposed to happen. What was supposed to happen was the French army with Rochambeau had linked up. They were in Newport, Rhode Island, and they had basically done nothing. There was one attempt to jointly operate, but it never went very far. But by '81, they decided they needed to make a strike. Washington, he had his issues too, and one of them was New York. He was fixed on New York. I guess getting kicked out and routed out of there just got under his skin. But everything he was doing, everything leading up to '81 was, how do we get New York back? Now, who would want it? I'm from there, but but he wanted to get New York. The French, not so much. They didn't think they had enough troops to take it. It's a big area, hard to occupy, hard to get at. I'll talk, if I have time, about hydrography again, but one of the problems with New York Harbor, if anybody familiar with New York, there's a place called Sandy Hook, New Jersey. It's a peninsula that stretches out. It forms the New York Harbor. That, during the time of the American Revolution, that Sandy Hook actually had sandbars that were permanent all the way across to Rockaway, New York, which is where I'm from. So you could only cross with capital ships twice a day when the tide was high. And the French at one time had a fleet there. They were looking to go in, but when they realized the locals explained to them what was going on with the tides and the bars, they didn't want to take the chance of not getting back out in time and getting pinned and then wiped out by the British. So they were very leery of New York for that reason. But the French did come up with a plan to put their fleet at the Chesapeake and threaten the Chesapeake. And the French Admiral d'Estaing, he sent a message that he would be at a certain date in October. He would be at the Chesapeake, and that's when Rochambeau convinced Washington that's where we need to go. Let's march on Yorktown. By this time, Cornwallis is in there defending, and they had an opportunity. Interestingly enough, the reason that he was able to get to there was supposed to be a British fleet guarding the Chesapeake, but when the Dutch in there was an island called St. Eustatius in the Caribbean. It was one of the transit points for a lot of the smuggling into weaponry and stuff into America. British decided to take the island and sack it, basically occupied it, and the delay that particular operation caused prevented Admiral Rodney and a British fleet from being up in the area where they might have. They came in later, but by that time the French were already in position, and the French fleet was able to defeat them at the Battle of the Capes, and it was one of the first big defeats by the British Navy in history. So you had two really interesting things happening at once. So Washington decides, okay, we will use the idea of going at New York against the British. And he started sending out patrols, building works around New York, places, jumping off points for the troops. He allowed couriers to be captured. There was one British spy that was actually working for the Americans. They were able to get him intelligence about the attack on New York. So General Clinton, who at this time is the commander of British forces in New York City and the New York area, was convinced they were going to attack. They marched down from upper New York and New England with the French. They form up like they're going to attack New York. They're in that part of New Jersey, right across on Staten Island. And then at the last minute, they turn south. And by the time the British figure out what happened, they'd stolen a couple of days' march on the British and were well on their way. The French went by sea. They got on boats. The Americans marched and made their way down to Virginia. So it was a very well executed set of activities and feints and things to send a signal to the British. Got the American and French army down in the Virginia area, and where they finally threatened, encircled, and took Yorktown. I won't go into that. I think everybody knows about that. But it was a really good strategic move. All the logistics behind it for that period of time to move an American army with those types of roads and keep them equipped. Really amazing thing. And then, of course, the world's turned upside down. Another British army surrenders to the Americans. A lot of fighting along the way and military action. But at the end of the day, strategically getting those forces there without the British being able to react in time was what won that particular campaign. I don't like to oversell the role of intel, deception, and all these things, because they're really just part of they're just pieces in a very large puzzle. This particular time, this particular campaign, they made a big difference. And that leads us to our next one, which is a discussion of Washington as a case officer. And he was his own, besides the commander-in-chief, consumer of intelligence. He was also in charge of collection. He had a gentleman named Benjamin Talmadge working for him. And Talmadge was an infantry officer at the beginning of the war from Connecticut, trained school teacher. But he wound up in late 76, early 77, they formed a couple of Continental Cavalry Dragoon regiments, and Washington had the idea of taking this young man, giving him command of one of the troops, and that was kind of his cover. So his troop was actually an operational intelligence unit. They carried information, they recruited spies, they made all the traditional things in a very 18th century way, but they would meet with sources, they would gather information, they would do direct reconnaissance, the whole 9 yards. I'm not going to go into the Culper Ring and all that. That was one network of agents that Talmadge ran that operated out of Lower Manhattan, where the British were, and transmitted intelligence from there out to Long Island, Setauket, and from there it was carried across the water to Connecticut, and then fast rider back down to wherever Washington was, whether it was upper New York or New Jersey. And the Culper Ring was actually involved in the deception plan for Yorktown as well. So Washington used lots of everything at his means to send that signal. But the TV show turned, I don't know, anybody's watched that show? Yeah. The history is not too good, and they actually literally take almost all the characters and twist the way they operated and who they were. So if you like the uniforms and the clothing and all that, and the action, it's kind of fun. But the actual things that happened certainly didn't happen when, where, why, and how this particular show portrayed it. But the loyalist and patriot nexus, that gave both sides ample opportunity for espionage, recruiting people, betrayals, all that went on from before the war right through the end of the war. Our first services set up were these committees of secret correspondence. Committees of correspondence sent messages, but the secret committees did local and not so local level collection. A guy named John Jay, Supreme Court Justice later on, and an ambassador, but he was a local New York leader, a lawyer, and he set up a committee for the detection of spies, initially based out of New York, because New York at that time, and we're talking 76, late 75, early 76, was very on the balance as to which way it would go. Parts of the state were very pro-American, parts were pro-British. Tradecraft was developed. They used dead drops, they used live drops, accommodation addresses. They They use secret writing, they use codes, ciphers, all these things that we do in a different way today were done in a much more primitive way back then. In fact, John Jay's brother, whose name was James Jay, he was a sir, he was actually a knighted, and he was kind of a scientist and inventor. He invented an advanced form of secret writing. So before that, they used a chemical, and then you use kind of lemon juice to bring out the print. He invented one that had two different types of chemicals. So there was no way you had to have the other chemical to get to the writing. You couldn't just say, oh, this might be secret writing. And what they would do is they'd write letters with big space between the lines so you could get your secret code in there. Unless you had the other chemical, you couldn't get in and get even if you had the paper, you couldn't read it. John Champ, he's from Aldie, Virginia. He was in the Continental Army. He was a sergeant major under a guy named Light Horse Harry Lee, who was a cavalry commander and Robert E. Lee's father, who was a hell of a crazy guy. But Champ was selected after Benedict Arnold betrayed us. He was made a general in the British Army, and he was in New York raising loyalist forces to fight us. Champ volunteered to desert to the British Army and set up Benedict Arnold to be captured, kidnapped by Washington and brought back for court-martial. So he got into the British Army. They accepted him. They believed him. He was ensconced. He did determine, one of his missions was to determine whether Benedict Arnold had any co-conspirators. And he kind of ruled that out, that he acted alone. So that message got back to Washington, but just as they were about to snatch him and they had this operation set up, they got orders to go south to the Carolinas or to Virginia. And that night at the last minute, his brigade gets on ships. I talked about the tides in New York. You could only leave at certain times. And that's what drove this. So Champ, next thing you know, get on board, Champ, we're going. So he couldn't, he had people ready, he had boats ready to take him across the river, all that, and the plot failed. And Benedict Arnold went to Virginia, where he almost captured Thomas Jefferson in a raid up the river towards Richmond, and sent Jefferson running for his life, and just generally ticked off a lot of people, but strategically he didn't do very much for the cause. Benjamin Franklin, that's another enigma wrapped in a riddle. Some might think that he was actually a British agent throughout the war. I actually think he was not, but he liked the idea that people thought he was. And he wound up becoming one of a lot of the strategic, diplomatic, political moves by the country. He was sort of that hidden hand, and then he wound up going over to Europe and got involved in, he was actually at the tail end of what was a little known covert action that the French had set up in support of us. I don't know how many of you guys like opera, but The Marriage of Figaro, pretty famous opera. Well, the author of that was Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. Now, he did not write the opera, he wrote a play. He was a playwright, a clockmaker, a confidant of King Louis XVI. Think of Austin Powers with a three-cornered hat. But he loved America. He liked the idea of liberty. Again, as I said, the French were following the political situation both in Britain and in the colonies. He convinced Charles Gravier, Duc de Vergennes, who was the foreign minister of France, that they ought to try to help the Americans even if they don't come in overtly on the American side. It took some doing. Silas Deane, he met with Silas Deane, and he and Silas Deane came up with the idea of setting up basically a front company that would help funnel support to the Americans, well, ostensibly keeping the French out of the war. So they created this Rodrigue Cortelet and Company, and it was registered as a Spanish company. Beaumarchais owned a chunk of it, the French government owned a chunk of it, and they were also stockholders. But it its covert mission was to deliver weapons to the Americans, and that's just some of the numbers, rough numbers on what were delivered to the Americans. What made this interesting was they went to the King of France. He was not in favor of it, even though he kind of tended towards supporting the Americans. He was still, but they knew they had to rearm. They had, expended a lot in the French and Indian War. So the idea was, let's take all of this army surplus stuff out of the magazines and fortresses throughout France, and let's sell them to the Americans, take the cash, and we'll buy new equipment for the war that we know we're going to fight with the British pretty soon. So it's pretty shrewd. Americans traded crops, tobacco mostly, other crops, a lot funneling into the West Indies. This island, Saint Eustatius, is one big area, but the Hortelier would sell things into the various islands, and the exchange would happen there, and then the Americans would smuggle the weapons through the British into continental America. And that's why at some of these bigger battles later in the war, where we actually were able to stand up to the British, we were using the French muskets, French cannon, French uniforms, blankets, tents, all these things, not to mention bayonets, which made all the difference. Later on, Dean got recalled. They brought in, Ben Franklin came in, Arthur Lee of the Lee family of Virginia. They came in and they formed they were the American commissioners in Paris. Dean got caught up. He got accused by Lee of misappropriating money. Nothing was ever proven, but he went back to face Congress, and they never really gave him a hearing, and he basically went off into obscurity. Franklin stayed on. Lee eventually got recalled himself. John Adams wound up going there as we started negotiating the peace treaty. But all the while, Franklin was surrounded by spies. His personal secretary was a British agent. Everybody who worked in the American Commission, except those 3 Americans, were recruited by the British. The theory is Franklin knew this, so he accepted it, and every word he said and uttered, everything he ever wrote, because both the French and the British were intercepting their correspondence and reading their messages. He operated in the open that way. That's kind of the claim to fame. There was a book on that called, and I can't think of the name of the author, The Great, I want to say The Great Diversion, but it was about, pardon? Improvisation. There you go. So you've read it. Yeah. It's one of there's another one called The Secret War that was written in the 50s. There isn't a lot out there on this. It's really fascinating. I'm amazed that nobody's made a movie or anything out of that whole particular story. But the British had us completely, everything penetrated. French had some penetrated. They were both spying on each other. So Paris was a real, it was like the Berlin of the American Revolution, I guess. I talked a little bit about the trade craft, so I'm not going to, I think I've covered all that. I did, so we can go on. Let's see if we have, I talked a little bit about the shoals, and the hydrography was not a science until the latter part of the 18th century, kind of developed by the French, but people measured the waterways. Very important because of the coastal area and the rivers. The pilots and the local fishermen became very important assets. So it was key to have them on your side if you're going to operate effectively, and that went both ways. But it was very critical to know the waterways and you had to know it through the people that lived there. So recruiting them and getting those people on your side, either through affection or coercion, was very important. Gaspé Affair, that was an anti-smuggling British ship that ran aground, and the Americans stormed it and burnt it while it was stuck aground. That was just one of the nasty things that led to the American Revolution. I talked about Sandy Hook. In the Carolinas, especially North Carolina, a couple of things kept North Carolina pretty much quiet and leaning towards the Americans. And one was the Battle of Morse Creek Bridge early in the war, where the lowland American patriots fought the highland Scottish pro-British forces in a small battle near what is today Fayetteville, North Carolina, and at Cross Creek. The Highlanders were beaten handily and driven back into the Carolina Piedmont, and never to come back out again in any meaningful way. Interestingly enough, most of these guys were descendants of or actual men who fought at the Battle of Culloden in 1745 and were totally destroyed and mistreated by the British, but they were given lands in the Carolinas, sort of a second chance. And for that reason, they stayed, despite everything else, many of them stayed loyal to the king. I found that kind of fascinating. But the coastal area of Carolina was controlled by Americans. British could never get their ships up the Cape Fear River or operate very effectively along the coast. There were a couple of forts that were captured back and forth, but essentially that gave the Americans the edge. And not so much in the Charleston area. It kind of went both ways, and they certainly, for a while, turned that into their green zone. The Chesapeake. When you think about the war, if you look at the map, and I'm not going to put it back up there, but one has to wonder, why didn't the British, having all this naval force, and this was really their strategic advantage, why they didn't make the Chesapeake more of a place to operate from? Wide waterway. You would have controlled 3 states by controlling the Chesapeake and staying there. If you're going to make anything your green zone, why not that? I don't have an answer to this, by the way. This is just a question I'll throw out there. But Virginia was kind of quiet until the latter part of the war, and it makes you wonder why they didn't try to push there rather than some of the other sideshows that they wound up pursuing. I don't know. I talked earlier about smugglers and privateers. Could do a whole talk on the privateers, because by the end of the war we had swarms of small boats out there tracking down British ships all over the world, not just along the Atlantic coast. They were in the Caribbean, they were off the Atlantic, they were in the English Channel. Sometimes we get captured and these guys get taken back to Britain and hung. Sometimes not, but you can make a lot of money if you went out, because you basically had a prize ship that you could sell, usually to France, for a lot of money. So we actually had units of men who were sailors who would ground their arms and go back to sea and become privateers. And although we'd lose a regiment or two, they were very effective. By the end of the war, British shipping was severely ravaged by this. Money was being lost, taxes were being lost, and there was a lot of pressure from the merchant class in Britain to end the war and come to terms with the Americans. As much as anything else, that was a factor in bringing Britain to the table on our terms. Right up until the end, they thought they could negotiate on their terms, but at the end, things kind of flipped. And of course, ships got grounded everywhere, and at the tactical level, that could make a difference. Okay, I think I've talked about this war as a sort of insurgency all along. No ideology involved, unless you consider not having a king your ideology, because that was really the biggest single difference between us and the British. But we had the Whigs going on, so there was the political aspect to it. The Loyalists never gelled as a really good counter-guerrilla counterpart to the Americans. So you have to think, if the war started with 30% being loyal and 30% being patriot, why couldn't the British leaven that loyalist group much better? I think they were mishandled. I think the British approached them the wrong way, and they approached the British the wrong way. There was always the attitude of we're subordinate to the British. Had they been more to the forefront throughout the war, I think politically things might have been a lot different. And populace and resource control, we had support from an external, which was France. We certainly had, borders didn't seem to mean much in the scheme of things. So we were able to get ships and people in and out of a country, despite the overwhelming British naval strength. And the war was savage at the local level. I talked about the green zone. I think that was, it created a psychology there and in Charleston that I think backfired. Cowboys and Skinners, we've all heard of cowboys and Indians, but cowboys were loyalists, guerrillas. Skinners were patriot guerrillas. They were a couple of chromosomes away from being gangsters. They killed, they raped, they looted, pillaged, they killed each other, killed anybody else who got in their way. Primarily in the New York, New Jersey area is where these guys. down in the Carolinas, everybody was they just didn't use those terms. And I view the privateers as kind of our guerrillas at sea. That war, I think, stressed the British out tremendously. And, Christian Huck. Christian Huck was a German immigrant from the Palatinate, settled in the Philadelphia area. And in the lead up to the war, he was pro-British, and he had his property taken from him by the local authorities. So he went over to the Loyalist side. He joined a German Loyalist unit, and then later on went south when the British went south into the Carolinas, where he raised hell with people. He was basically a cowboy, and he fought lots of small actions, but he was part of the British Legion. I talked about Tarleton being this really bad dude, and Huck was, actually his German name was Houck, H-O-U-C-K. He was part of some of the big battles there, the Waxhaws in 1780, destroyed Hill's Iron Works, was an important Patriot supplier, and the headquarters of a famous militia unit there. And he became known as a just a really bad person, a killer. And he was finally taken out in an operation. They finally were able to interdict him in latter part of the war, and the operation was aimed at killing him, and they killed him. But he was an example of, and he wasn't even a Southerner. He came down from the north, and a lot of vicious fighting, some of it to no real end. I talked about the diplomacy in the coalition earlier, so I will say that Spain operated in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, but again, that took the British off their main objective. They grabbed Dutch islands, to include the British. Well, I talked about the British fleet at St. Eustatius, so we'll let that one slide. But the cost to Britain. Britain viewed the Indies much more importantly than they did the American colonies. It's hard to think today, but dollar for dollar, and coming into the British coffers, much more came out of the West Indies than came out of the 13 colonies. So there was real lack of vision here. I mean, not seeing the advantage of expanding west, not seeing the advantage of a prosperous America. And that's what this came down to. There was actually a faction in Parliament that did not want a prosperous America because they knew that it could be a threat to Britain someday. So many who were anti-American largely for that reason. They viewed it as a long-term threat. And perhaps they were right. Others viewed us as a long-term partner. Those were sort of the dividing lines within Britain. But they certainly put a lot of effort then into defending and taking islands in the Indies towards the latter part of the war, again, weakening British forces fighting on the North American continent. And then I think the diplomacy went on for a couple of years. The British were very, very obstinate in their diplomatic lines of discussion. They, right up until the very end, thought they could flip the American colonies back to Britain. The French did not want that. The French were afraid of that, so they had their agenda. So there was a kabuki dance amongst the Americans under Franklin, the French, and the British. And we kind of betrayed the French. I mean, our agreement, our treaty of cooperation in 78, indicated that neither would make peace without the other's approval. And of course, we disregarded that at the end. But the British gave us everything we thought we wanted. And I talked about the mercantile interests. It gets down to the money, and it cost the British a lot to fight this war. So I'm not going to beat this to death. We can have a discussion, but I do think the challenges that they faced were prescient of what great powers have faced throughout the ages. How do you do these things? How do you make them work in a way that's intelligent and cost effective? You can win. You can win a war like this, but at what cost? So I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to open this up to discussion rather than go through the remaining slides. Yeah.
Curious, the population of loyalists bailed and went to Canada or went back to England or went somewhere else?
Most of the loyalists bailed.
Did they?
Yeah, because they lost their land, they lost their property. Most went to Canada. Some went to the islands in the Caribbean, where they thought they'd be given land, but they weren't. They were very mistreated. Most of them barely were eking out a living up along the maritime provinces of Canada. So what happened was many of them emigrated, moved west into what is today Ontario, and were able to get farms along that, which kind of played out interestingly because in the War of 1812, it was those people who formed the backbone of the Canadian-British forces who defeated the American invasions into Canada. So that's that's a whole nother area of...
Especially, see, the ones people I've known from Western Canada despise the French Canadians.
Oh yeah, that's another issue. The Americans, we tried to bring France into the war, and I didn't go over the invasion of Canada in 1775, but there was under a general named Montgomery, two-pronged attack, one straight up New York to take Montreal, the other went up through New England under Benedict Arnold, and they were going to take Quebec, or they were going to meet. They finally did meet, but Arnold lost so many troops marching in bad weather through the woods. There were no roads. They had some Indian guides, but then they had Indians fighting them. And then Sullivan took Montreal pretty easily, but they wound up in front of Quebec in December. They thought the Canadians would come over to their side, and they didn't. They fought the Canadians, French. They fought the few British troops that were there, and Sullivan was killed in battle, and then the cause collapsed after that. It had a chance. Benedict Arnold got wounded outside of Quebec, so he wound up recovering, and then the next spring the British were going to invade down through Lake Champlain and Lake George. Benedict Arnold, the traitor, on his own, built a navy and fought the British. He lost. He fought 3 battles, but he slowed down their invasion to where they pulled back to Canada, and he saved New York from going over to the British very early in the war. So the guy did a lot of great things before he became a traitor. It's an amazing story, and we focus a lot on the bad, but there was a time when he was a force for good instead of evil. Good novel on that, Rabble in Arms, by the same guy who wrote Northwest Passage, Kenneth Roberts. So that's a pretty good, if you want a novelized version of the invasion of Canada. Any other questions? Yes?
You went through secret operations and secret intelligence. What about psychological operations? You have a place where maybe 60% of the people were either for the British or uncertain. And I'm sure through the newspapers there were certain themes to win people over.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much, the British alliance with the indigenous people, the Native Americans, which I guess at a particular moment were considered savages and really demonized, and also the British intention probably to free slaves. So I guess there would be also an element having to do with slavery that would be involved in.
Well, let me start with the last one. That's a good one. The British were very good at playing that up, and that was probably the big moral flaw in the American cause, and it was written about and talked about both in Britain. At every opportunity, they would rub it in the face of all these, mostly Southern, patriots who were from the South. But it was always a blemish. Franklin faced it. He was the colony's representative in London for 10 years prior to the war. This is a constant theme. The British were very good at bringing that up. What they did try to enlist African Americans, if I can call them that now, slaves, former slaves. They were promised all kinds of things if they'd come over to the British side. Many of them did. They got nothing out of it. Most of them at the end of the war were shipped to the Indies and sold back into slavery or became indentured servants, so they were not treated well. Obviously, any who went over to the British and didn't leave were not treated well. There's some interesting talk about how many of them were in the American Army, the Continental Army. Bottom line, about 5%. At any one time, probably 5% of the Continental Army was African American. Those numbers shifted, they varied. Famously, Rhode Island had an entire regiment of freedmen. I forget the actual numerical, it might be the first Rhode Island, I don't remember the number, but they recruited entire, and there were people that were anti-slavery on the American cause. Nathaniel Greene was a Quaker. He was most of the Quakers were rabidly anti-slavery. Some were ambivalent. Obviously, most of the Southern types were ambivalent to pro-slavery. There's a movie coming out on a guy named John Lawrence. Henry Lawrence was the president of the First Continental Congress. He was a South Carolina congressman, politician, and a rich planter. His son John was an aide-de-camp to George Washington, and a very brave soldier, young guy. He was anti-slave. He had a big falling out with his father and with his fellow Carolinians over that. He was very, very close to Alexander Hamilton, who was also anti-slavery. So even then, these issues were boiling up. The Native American issue, same thing. That was sort of localized because areas in the South where they actually did get along, the Cherokee and they had their wars, but there were accommodations between the settlers there and the tribes. Not so much up in New York because the Iroquois had such a reputation as fierce warriors, and people were afraid of them. So there was constant back and forth. One of the worst massacres in the war was against a village of I don't know if they were Iroquois or not. I don't remember the tribe, but it was in Pennsylvania, and they were part. I don't recall whatever it might be. I won't say, but anyway, they were completely massacred by and they were Christians. They had been converted by German missionaries from the Palatinate, so it was a Christian Native American community, and part of this whole scheme against the British and the Indians that were supporting the British, they got scarfed up. Propaganda was huge. It was a big part of the war.
I'm sorry, who killed those Indians? Which side?
Patriots, Americans. So, there was a lot of back and forth in New York, especially. The Carolinas, the Indians got into it and then they backed out, and they were neutral, and some actually supported the Americans down in South Carolina, Georgia border. That kind of evened out. But propaganda, I probably should have gone into that, but there were pamphlets spread all over the place. Thomas Paine was a pamphleteer, The Times That Tries Men's Souls, and literally his pamphlet, a propaganda piece, if you will, but it inspired the Americans and rallied them in late '76. And clearly in Europe there was all kinds of information and disinformation spread on both sides. I'd call that war a draw, maybe an edge to the Americans, but important part of both sides' strategy. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Prisoner exchanges and, yes, how did that work out?
Prisoner exchanges were important. General Lee, I told you he got captured, Major General Charles Lee. They held him for about a year, and then he got exchanged for another officer. General Sullivan, who led the attack against the Indians, he was actually captured on Long Island defending those passes and was later exchanged. So this was pretty typical throughout the war. There were many incidents of it going south where maybe somebody was killed before they got exchanged. That did happen. There's some and these were celebrated in the papers. These things were part of the propaganda war. Lee got exchanged back. He once again became deputy to George Washington, and some say he tried to deliberately lose the Battle of Monmouth. I didn't talk about that battle in June of 1778. He didn't want to attack the British, who were exposed. Then he was forced into taking command, and when he did, his tactics were not well thought through, and at the first opportunity he started withdrawing the army, and Washington challenged him, he relieved him, and he was later court-martialed and cashiered from the army. But there were exchanges at all levels. Officers had a better chance of getting exchanged. The last thing I'll close on is the prison ships, the hulks. If you ever go to New York City, there's a place called the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was called Wallabout Bay. When the British captured Americans, they took ships, demasted them and floated them as hulks and made those the prisons. They had one prison on Manhattan called the Sugar House, which is a warehouse for sugar that they used for officers. But most of all the enlisted and some of the officers went to the hulks. Throughout the course of the war, about 15,000 wound up there, and they all died. They died. They were starved to death. You know, it was another Andersonville, the same thing you see in so many wars. Pretty interesting. At the end of the war, their bones were all buried there at the site of the Navy Yard, and then in 1889 they moved them to a place called Fort Greene, which was named after General Nathaniel Greene. It was an actual fort during the Battle of Long Island. It's now a park in Brooklyn. It's where Spike Lee is from, that part of Brooklyn, Fort Greene. There's an obelisk there that was erected in 1889 at the center of the park on a hill. And in a crypt under that, they took all the bones of these patriots who died on those hulks, and those bones are interred under the monument. So if you ever go to New York for whatever reason, you wind up in Brooklyn, check out Fort Greene. My last time there were one or two Europeans, believe it or not, checking out the monument. No Americans. I thought that was kind of sad, actually. But the areas now are really good. It used to be not so good of an area, but now it's all really nice, kind of trendy, lots of restaurants right near downtown Brooklyn and all that stuff. So very, very little of New York's American Revolution has been captured, other than St. Paul's Church in Manhattan, Trinity, a few other places. Fort Washington, New York, has still got part of the area where Fort Washington was, and some of the war was fought, but most of it, I went looking for a place where about 300 Americans were killed in an attack against the British and buried, and you know, it's nothing but garages and wise guys and stuff in Park Slope, so some of it's just totally gone. One last interesting anecdote: in the Battle of Long Island, there was a famous engagement by the old Red House. It's a small farmhouse. These are all Dutch-type homes, stone. This one was the center of a big battle when the British cut the Americans off. A lot of fighting took place right there. Later on, in the mid part of the 19th century, that house still existed, and it became the clubhouse of what later became the Brooklyn Dodgers baseball team. So, what that connects to the American Revolution, I don't know. I don't know what that says, but the Dodgers moved west, and maybe Manifest Destiny was even destined from that period of time. Any other questions? So again, the idea is interesting war. If you're going to look at politics, war, intel, national security, I think there are lessons. I really just touched on a lot of things. You can do a deep dive, or a bunch of areas to go to. I'll give you some books. There's one called Patriot Battles, fairly recently written by a former, I think it was New York Times writer. Pretty good. Glorious Cause, that won a Pulitzer Prize. That was Robert Middlecoff is the author. Rebels in Redcoats, sort of, that was a guy named George Scheer and Hugh Rankin, two authors wrote that. David McCullough, pretty famous, John Adams book, but he wrote a book called 1776. It's a pretty good survey of that 1 year of the war. Another one that's a sleeper, and I stumbled on this, and it's recent too, and the author is a former aide to George Bush I, who then became a newspaper man, Kevin Phillips. And the book is called 1775, A Good Year for Revolution. But it's really a good narrative of the war itself. It goes beyond just 1775. Obviously goes deep on, but his theory is the war really began in 70. It should be the spirit of 75, not 76. That's kind of his theory. Washington Spies by Alexander Rose. I'll go into a lot of this stuff around, primarily the New York area. Just a nice, good battle book that's very deep and accurate is Saratoga by David Ketchum. And that goes to all the activities up in upper New York, Ticonderoga, Saratoga, Fort Stanwix out west, and everything in between. Battle for New York by Barnett Schechter, another good one. I know some companies have turned that book into, you can actually go to New York and take tours based on some of the things in that particular book. George Washington's War by Robert Leckie. And that one is sort of a series of cameos. I find that one, and I'm not through the whole book to be honest, but very interesting profiles. There will be a chapter on George III and what made him tick, that kind of thing. So it's not just about, it was one off from what I thought it would be. It's about a lot of things around George Washington, not about him. There's plenty of biographies of Washington. I won't even begin to name them. And then the last one I'll give a shout out for is Spies, Traitors, and Patriots by Kenneth A. Degler. That came out about a year and a half ago. And that is that one is good because he covers parts of the stuff in the South that a lot of these other books don't go into. A lot of them are centered around New York. This one does talk about spy activities, tactical intelligence taking place in Virginia and the Carolinas as well. So those are, you can also, if you grab my card on the way out the door, I have a blog. I don't blog as often as I should, but I try to get one blog out a month. This is nonfiction, people, places, and things of the Revolution, sometimes some tongue-in-cheek articles. I won't even begin to tell you some of them. I can do some wacky stuff there too, depending on whether I've had a martini before I sit at the computer. But I try to find things that are a little bit unusual or not so usual. When I profile people, I typically pick folks you wouldn't have heard of normally. So I won't pick Washington. I write about them, but Green. I'll pick people that you never heard of, and or probably never heard of, or things like this guy Galvez. I wrote a blog on Galvez. I did write one on the connection between the American Revolution and the Russian invasion of the Crimea 2 years ago, and I use Blogspot, and Blogspot enables me to see where people are accessing my site from, what part of the world. I actually get a nice little geospatial map, and it'll turn light green, middle green, dark green. Well, right after that one, Russia was dark green. I mean, it was so dark green it was almost black. But the connection is that John Paul Jones, after the war, became an admiral for Catherine the Great, and he commanded a squadron as part of the Russian attack on the Crimea. He did some interesting and bold things. He also got in a lot of trouble. Our naval officers in those days were really tough guys. And he just got into it with the Russians and the politics and eventually got run out of Russia. But that is the connection between the American Revolution and Putin's invasion of the Crimea, from my wacky point of view. So I try to do some of this tongue-in-cheek. The books, same thing. The books are, they're straight up. The history part's really good, I think. I try to stick to the actual facts. I won't warp history. I did one anachronistic thing. My main character has a weapon that I'm not sure was invented then, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking it was in prototype. So, and all it is, it's a Hessian musket that enables him to attach a sword bayonet to it. And that did not come in really, I don't think, until the latter part of the 18th century. Tyrolean Jaegers during the Napoleonic Wars, they had them. So that's my little anachronism. Everything else, I'll do research. How far did a weapon fire? How do they fight? A little bit of what they felt like. I try to keep the espionage tradecraft simple and not too extravagant. But it's kind of a coming-of-age story about a guy who immigrates to America, didn't plan on getting into the war. He's from Frederick, Maryland. He gets caught up in a situation and has to join the Army. And Washington sees him perform a heroic act at the Battle of Long Island, an actual act that happened. He just didn't do it. But in my story, he did. And he decides to use him for intelligence operations pre-Benjamin Talmadge. Later on, Talmadge comes in, winds up becoming his boss, and that creates a whole new set of stuff. Anyway, they're fun. I think I do them to tell a story, to teach a little bit, have a little bit of fun. I'll leave it at that. I've got 2 out. I got a 3rd coming out this year. I've written 2 more, but I don't have a contract for those yet.
Both of those are available for purchase.
Yeah, and I've got
the use of females in those spy networks and things like that.
Yeah, I really need to go back and redo this and add some of that in, but there were females. There was an Agent 355, which in the code that Washington used, they used three numeric codes, and they had like a one-time book, so Washington had a number. 355 actually meant female or lady. But there was a woman, the Culper Ring, and a guy named Townsend, who was actually in Britain. He was a guy acquainted with all the British officers. He either had a wife or mistress. There was a female involved, and there's been some writing on this. I probably need to add more of that kind of stuff. There were several. Lydia Dara was another one. She allegedly warned Washington that the British were going to counterattack him before Valley Forge. They were going to try to wipe his army out at a place called White Marsh, which was the actual last engagement before Valley Forge. She was able to slip out of where the British were and warn Washington, and he was able to get his defenses set, and they actually repulsed the British at White Marsh. So there's an example. Up in New England, the initial British commander in Boston was a general named Gage. His wife was an American-born woman. It said, and I did a blog on her, it was called "A Lady Was a Spy." And she is believed to possibly have been passing intelligence to the Americans. So yeah, that's an area that I probably need to go more into. Yeah.
So who do you think Agent 355 was?
This will have to be the last question.
Well, all I'll say is this. There is a 355 in the Patriot Spy. So I created a female character who's caught up in the war. I won't say she's Agent 355, but there is a female caught up in the war. But I really don't know. This is some of this stuff, if you research it, there isn't a lot written. They didn't put a lot in writing. Washington was notorious. He would go into towns even after the war when he was president and go up and meet people and talk to them who had been agents, only he knew what they had done. And there were some who appeared to be, throughout the war, pro-British and got beaten, gotten property taken away, and some of them never got any compensation for it. So a lot of the information came out in the early part of the 19th century when people were going in, putting in VA-type claims for veterans' benefits and benefits for serving in the war. And you could put it in if you could prove your ancestor did something. There was some money for widows, orphans, that kind of thing. Some of that comes out of that. I don't have, so I made something up. We'll just leave it at that.
Well, sir, on behalf of IWP, I want to thank you again for coming in, and I hope we give him one more round of applause.
Okay.